were changing. The reports, in this case the task force report from the Engineering Dean's Council, argued that we need some more effective intervention programs. They argued, quote, "There is a sense of urgency in the efforts to enhance the participation of women and minorities in the engineering profession. The retention rate of women and underrepresented ethnic minorities in engineering appears to be substantially lower than that of white males." So they argued for basically new methods for increasing supply. And the words recruitment and retention emerged in the lexicon of educators to an extent, to a much higher extent than before in the United States. Now, a second contribution to this task force council, which you may not be reading, explains in greater detail the demographics of the student pipeline, and I'll share with you some of the data from that analysis. From the 70s to the 1980s, there was a significant, indeed dramatic, increase in the participation of women and minorities in engineering education. From 1973 to 1983, the percentage of women in engineering increased from 4.7% to 17%. So this was a significant increase. The percentage of blacks in the population of engineering graduates increased from 2.8% to 6%. The percentage of Hispanics increased from 2.9% to 4.6%. And indeed, the percentage participation of Asian Americans, people of Asian descent, increased from 1.7% to 6.5%. However, since the mid-1980s, these numbers not only peaked, but began to decline. And one of the dimensions that suggested that the future might not be bright, at least bright in terms of increasing numbers through the attraction of people from these underrepresented groups, is that it comes from the retention data. Overall in engineering, there's roughly a 70% rate of completion of students, of engineering freshmen completing degrees. Roughly 70% overall would complete their degrees. For black freshmen, the rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%. For Hispanics, somewhere in the neighborhood of the high 40s. For women, in the 50s to the 60s. So raise the question that something is going on inside of engineering curricula that somehow leads to a greater rate of departure of these of groups other than white males. And it was argued in this one article that as to the replacement of new faculty, the more foreign faculty become, quite possibly the less attractive engineering education may appear for American women, in part because of the cultural stereotypes about gender that foreign faculty might bring to bear in the classroom. Now, take note that all of this analysis of numbers in engineering focused entirely on the question of supply and not on the question of demand. And indeed, there's a whole new phenomenon occurring outside of engineering education during the late 1980s that will affect the structure of demand, and that is the restructuring of industry that led to significant layoffs. So we will find that this reform movement number one ultimately loses some of its steam because of decreasing the changing structure of demand in the engineering workplace. But nonetheless, the task force and other groups working in parallel pressed on with a range of findings and recommendations. The task force first identified a few major themes. The first being, most importantly, we need to attract more of the most able students. How can we identify and attract able students? Secondly, we have to somehow change the students' experiences inside of engineering education by developing a more nurturing environment Perhaps some of you experienced what I experienced as a freshman engineer, sitting in the auditorium listening to the dean telling me to look to the left and look to the right because either 1/3 or 1/2 or maybe more of you people in the room are not going to be here at graduation. The question was, who is going to make it and who is not? A lot of students' experiences the first couple of years in engineering education are all about having to demonstrate that one belongs. The argument from the task force and from other engineering groups held that maybe we should turn the whole attitude around and view ourselves as, in a way, recruiting students, as needing to to attract them in, to demonstrate the wonderful values of engineering, rather than demanding that they prove themselves. Third central point, major theme, is that engineering needed to be made more accessible to capable students at all points in their careers. Somehow we need to change the image of engineering education as sequences of required courses, which make the curriculum fairly impermeable to anyone who doesn't come in at the freshman level. According to the task force, the highly prescribed, vertically organized academic programs are not the only path to making noteworthy contributions to engineering. Engineering programs should try to attract students from other disciplines as well. The task force offered a series of findings and recommendations, which I'll try and summarize for you here. Firstly, regional consortia among universities and colleges can be beneficial in providing supplemental programs at the pre-college level for recruiting women and minorities. And so it was argued that each school, each university should try to find partners in its region among high schools, with other colleges, in order to increase the overall supply of students into engineering curricula, especially from underrepresented groups. It was argued that the current structure of guidance counseling at the high school level doesn't work very well for engineering. Guidance counselors don't know much about engineering. So engineers needed to develop and distribute basically public relations materials to high schools, so the high schools could better help point qualified students towards engineering. It was argued that we needed to strengthen the math and science dimensions of education at the K-12 level, as well as preparation in technology education. It was argued that students in community colleges might turn out to be an important supply source for colleges of engineering. 43% of students in college in the United States are attending two-year colleges. Half of those students come from underrepresented populations. Might there be a way for graduates of those institutions to make their way into engineering curricula, to somehow break in? What would it take? We needed to track retention rates. Schools are doing much better, but retention rates had not been calculated at all at that time. Might it be possible, number 6 in their list, might it be possible to attract students in from liberal arts programs into engineering by establishing dual degree and transfer programs? All this challenging, as you might imagine, the fundamental structure of engineering, science-based engineering education. The task force recommended, as did others, a series of studies and pilot projects designed to enhance the retention of underrepresented minorities. This is a point that we're going to take up at some length. The idea is to provide students with opportunities to make up deficiencies that they might have had by virtue of their high school education through some extended track programs. Maybe find ways of creating an educational environment that encourages every student to succeed, offering emotional support, offering friendships, offering ways of connecting with other people who appear to be the same or very similar. Work to discontinue practices that expect and depend on a certain number of student failures, or what students understand as weed out. Develop what have become known as bridge programs, providing transitional help, early nurturing to students as they move from high school to college. Work with departments of mathematics and chemistry and physics to explore what kinds of experience are taking place in their classes and examining the extent to which those basic science and mathematics classes might be contributing to retention problems. Foster the development of student organizations. For example, NASB, the National Association of Black Student Engineers. Establish advising systems and then monitor advising processes, seeking guidance and organizing guidance from faculty who have demonstrated a sensitivity to the needs of undergraduates. All these are suggested pilot project programs, many of which were put into place. Number 8, training teachers in human relations. Most PhDs have very low training in actual teaching. So it was argued that we need to add to the training in graduate education a lot of experience with teaching and place a greater emphasis on the importance of teaching. The task force argued that suggested that we establish as a benchmark a commitment to doubling the percentage of women in engineering, which had reached a high of in the neighborhood of 18 to 19% in the later middle to late 1980s, and then dropped back to something like 14% in the mid 1990s. Find ways of increasing the percentage and participation of blacks, Hispanics, American Indians. The task force argued that, quote, minority students who enter predominantly white institutions to study engineering meet barriers. Efforts of the past 5 years indicate that a properly conceived retention program can remove those barriers and bring about substantial improvements in the academic performance and retention of minority students, end quote. Finally, in order to retain graduate students and get more engineers going to graduate school, we needed to figure out ways of increasing interest in graduate education and hopefully increase the salaries of students who decided to move on.